Hey guys, Dan Duggan needs our help. And whatever happens to him has major implications for so many of us, whether you're American or not, and especially if you live in or ever plan on visiting any country that's allied with America. Now, under orders from the US, Dan has been kept locked up in a maximum security prison in his own country of Australia, while his 6 children have been growing up without their father for the past 3 years. I hadn't planned on doing many more videos like these ones, but we're really getting down to the wire here, and I wanted to give you guys some updates on what's happening with Dan, or fill you in if you haven't seen my previous videos about Dan. If any of you were following Julian Assange's case or know about it and were outraged at what the US was trying to do to him after he uncovered and reported on US war crimes, you should be even more worried about what's happening to Dan Duggan, because Dan is much closer to an ordinary citizen who didn't ever try to rock the boat at all. You may have thought that, well, you'd never be a Julian Assange and you'd never be in his situation, but so many of us are a bit more like Dan Duggan, relatively speaking. Now, in a moment, Robbie Barwick from the Australian Citizens Party, who has been in regular contact with Dan and his family, will join me for further details and discussion, but I'll start with the backstory so that you know what's going on. Dan Duggan, 57 years old, is a former US fighter pilot who immigrated to Australia in 2002. He's been described as many as a good man, a military veteran, a husband, a father to 6 Aussie children with no criminal history of any kind. After living 10 years in Australia full-time, he became an Australian citizen in January 2012 on Australia Day, and he relinquished his U.S. citizenship in the process as per U.S. law. Since then, he has been a sole Australian citizen. In Australia, Dan owned a Joy flight and training business which legally operated ex-military aircraft. And as regulated by Australian air law, he was an Australian certified flight instructor and trained pilots in these aircraft. In 2012, as a sole Australian citizen, no other citizenship anywhere else, he was invited to work part-time with other Australian pilots at a renowned test pilot school in South Africa. For this, the U.S. Department of Justice secretly indicted Dan, its ex-citizen, in 2017, falsely claiming that he conspired with his work colleagues in 2012 to provide military defense services to Chinese pilots in South Africa without first having obtained the required licensing. No military training occurred. No license was required. Dan knew nothing of the secret indictment for claims from over 13 years prior until his arrest on October 21st, 2022. And ever since then, he's been in maximum security prison. Only Dan has been singled out. None of his work colleagues face any charges, yet Dan faces a possible 65 years in U.S. jail. And when we speak to Robbie, we'll discuss what the possible true motives are here, what's really going on behind the scenes. But Dan vehemently denies any illegality. And the U.S. claims are not only false, but legally flawed. The U.S. has no jurisdiction. Neither Dan or his work colleagues were U.S. citizens at the time of the allegations. The extradition requirement of dual criminality in order to have an extradition to begin with doesn't exist either. Even if true, the falsely alleged activity would have been innocent when and where done and not criminal in the context of Australian law. He shouldn't even qualify for extradition, even if the claims were true. The Australian Attorney General's Department failed to abide by treaty reciprocity obligations. The U.S. would not extradite even a U.S. citizen for activity that was innocent when done in the context of law here. The Australian Attorney General also wrongly attempts to satisfy this missing dual criminality requirement through a disgraceful legal technicality. It has applied a law that was not passed until 2018 to Dan, 6 years after the fact. Such retrospectivity has never, ever been used in Australian extradition history before. It's not only prohibited by the treaty reciprocity, the sham 2018 law could never be used to charge Dan with an offense in Australia under any circumstances anyway. The unfairness imposed on Dan Duggan and his Australian family has been extreme. To hinder Dan's defense, on behalf of the U.S., Australian agencies have frozen his family assets and denied legal aid. Even ASIO, Australia's intelligence agency, was found by its Inspector General to have transcended the bounds of propriety in regards to Duggan. It's plainly obvious to any unbiased observer. Dan Duggan has become a geopolitical pawn through a vindictive U.S. Prosecution of an ex-citizen, with Australia pulled along on a tight leash. While a dangerous precedent here hangs in the balance for all Australians and everyone else, the Australian government continues to pander to an ever-increasing, unstable, and unreliable America. Everyone, especially Australians, need to be concerned about the Dan Duggan extradition case. If it can happen to Dan, an undisputed, innocent Australian citizen who violated no law, it can happen to anyone, anywhere, even if the US has no jurisdiction over that person. There are many more details surrounding how Dan crossed all his T's and dotted all his I's to make sure that what he was doing was all above board, but I'll get into that a little bit later with Robbie. Now, before I continue, I want to thank my subscribers who already followed Dan's case through my work on this channel. Apparently, we have been the single biggest force that has helped Dan fund his defense, spiting the US government, who has tried so hard to prevent Dan from being able to mount a defense against his extradition by, of course, freezing all his assets so he can't fund it on his own. Now, my longtime subscribers know that I never ask for money. I never opened up a Patreon or ask you to click a buy me a coffee link. So you know that when I ask you to help Dan, it's something that I feel is really important to do and that I really believe in. Dan has one final shot at blocking his extradition at an upcoming trial next month, but he has to be able to fund it. I'll leave the links in the description on how to help, but even if you're not in a position to donate anything towards his defense, please share his story and get more people to talk about it. The only thing the US government would hate more than Dan being able to fund his defense is to see more people pay attention to what they're doing to Dan. Now, with that said, and without further ado, let's bring Robbie Barwick into the discussion. Robbie Barwick, welcome back.
Thanks, Daniel.
All right, so let's hear what's going on. You've been in regular contact with Dan. Let's hear a little bit more about the story and what's going on.
Look, I just spoke to Dan this morning and yesterday morning, and it's really hard. I'm glad I get to do it. But it's really heartbreaking, based on everything that you've just gone through. And of course, his family is in a world of pain with the situation that they have to deal with. This is a young family who need their father. And they don't want to beg for money, Daniel. They genuinely don't want to beg for money. They have a property that they wanted to sell so they could fund his legal defense. And because it's Australia and our houses, our properties are too expensive, they're way overvalued. They had a contract on a property for $4.2 million, which would have funded a great legal defense for Dan. And the Americans got the Australian government to put a caveat on it so that they cannot sell it. And so they have no choice but to ask the Australian public for money because their government is not going to help them. And worse than not helping them, not only is the Australian government doing America's bidding, they're paying America's legal bills. All the US action in Australia against Dan Duggan to extradite him gets funded by the Australian government. So they've abandoned their own citizen and his family, and they're funding the other side. That's what he has to deal with. And so this is why we are reaching out to the public again for help. There's 5 weeks until his hearing on the 16th of October. This is a hearing where they're asking the courts to review the Attorney General's decision to allow his extradition. This is a very important review because under Australian law, although the extradition law and the extradition treaty with America is so twisted and terribly written and completely stacked in America's favor, the one safeguard is that the Attorney General of Australia has absolute final say and can just knock it back entirely. And so, funnily enough, the Attorney General who decided to extradite Dan Duggan is no longer there because we had an election in May. So there's a new Attorney General, and this new Attorney General so far is lying and saying she does not have the power to stop it, which is completely untrue. So hopefully all this gets tested in court. But to actually put up that legal defence, they need the Australian people and people of goodwill around the world to help them fund it because they're not going to get it from any other source. So please go to the link below, be as generous as you can, because as you said, this is a precedent. And he's an everyday guy, although, he's got special skills, of course, but there's a lot of ex-military people out there with special skills. They all do this. They make money in the private sector. But as a person and as a family man, he's an everyday guy. He did not look for trouble. 3 years after his training, after he did this training for which he's being extradited, Daniel, with that he's accused of training Chinese pilots, the Australian government, his government, invited Xi Jinping to Australia, got Xi Jinping to address our parliament and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with China.
Right.
That's how different the political climate was back then when Dan did this, right? So he was not, he was just going about his business. Everyone was doing business with China in 2012. China has a booming airline sector, and this is why Dan was training test pilots, and not just Chinese test pilots, but they came looking for him to make trouble, to make him some kind of an example. There's a few theories about why they've particularly targeted him, but they're trying to make an example of him, just an ordinary citizen, and the only support he's going to get is from his fellow human beings who can see the injustice in this.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable because too, I remember you saying that there were so many opportunities for the government or for people involved closely with him to tell him to not be doing this stuff if they were eventually going to say that there was a problem with this, which
Yep.
of course there wasn't. They're just making this up. But there were U.S. officials that actually visited that flight training school, right? They never said anything back then.
I've confirmed two times in 2012 when, and the timing is quite important, when the US authorities indicated they had no problem with what was happening at that flight training school in South Africa. One was when the officials from the US embassy in South Africa actually visited the flight training school as it was operational, just to observe what was going on. No, indicated no trouble, no problems whatsoever. And then Dan himself, when he came back to Australia, had contact, which he didn't initiate, with intelligence agencies, including US intelligence agencies. They sort of ambushed him in a meeting in the city he was in. And they raised the fact that he had been doing this training. And he said, because he's an Australian citizen, but he's an all-American boy, this guy, right?
Right.
He you know, there's no way he's the sort of person who wants to defy his government or a government that he's associated with. And he said, well, if there's a problem, I can stop. I don't have to do it. And they said, no problem. Right.
That's the
So
second confirmation.
Yeah, that's 2012. Therefore, why was he indicted in 2017, 5 years after that? And that gap itself, so forget about the confirmation that they didn't have any problem with it. That's confirmation they knew about it, and it still took till 2017 to indict him. That tells you there, just that time frame
Yeah.
tells you that this is political. It has nothing to do with him breaching some technical US law that ex-military have to get permission to do. It's nothing to do with that. It's political, and the big question is why. And we've got some theories on that, but
Right.
the bottom line is he's an entirely innocent man who has now been jailed for 3 years. By the time he has his hearing, it'll be 3 years despite having broken no Australian law in Australia and never
Mhm.
been charged with breaking a law in his whole life.
Yeah, it's remarkable too. And obviously, we'll just quickly mention it. We don't want to go into too much detail. We have some of that in our previous videos, but when he started a business in China also, which has nothing to do with the case, so it's not really
No,
relevant to begin with because they can't get him on anything with that.
yeah,
But the U.S. government tried to recruit him as a spy of sorts, and he refused to do it. He didn't want to get involved in that. So that could be a possible item of retaliation also, that he didn't get involved in that. But what does that tell us, though? That tells us that he doesn't want to get involved in that world. He just wants to have an above board business where he's following the rules, because he didn't want to get involved in any sort of this, spy business. And also, he had that confirmation 2 times when officials visited the school in South Africa, and when he specifically asked them when they were trying to recruit him, I believe it was
yeah,
the same time, that he said that I can stop doing this, or is this all okay? I won't do it if it's not okay. Obviously,
yeah.
completely above board guy that they're trying to get here. So 2 possible reasons for retaliation: 1, he refused to work with them on kind of some of this more shady stuff, and 2, like you said, to set an example to try to keep people as far away from this stuff as possible.
Well, you already referenced it in your introduction there. There's an office in Australia called the Inspector General of ASIO, and ASIO is our MI5 or FBI, right? It's the Domestic Security Agency, and that office said like we know the wording of the ruling, but we just don't know the details because it will never be released. But the Inspector General said that in Dan Duggan's case, ASIO transcended the bounds of propriety. Now, so in other words, ASIO did something wrong, and Dan and his team are not allowed to know what the details of that are, right? So we know there's something really shady right there. That may be a big part of the motivation. The other motivation is just the question of generally making an example of someone. Because he was indicted in 2017. Remember when the Trump administration came in with all their anti-China crazies in the Trump administration, right? So that may be just a general demonization of anyone doing business in China. Uh, there's potentially a more specific reason for going after him that might be related to AUKUS, which is this insane deal we have with the Americans and the Brits to spend 368 billion Australian dollars on their submarines. And the reason that Dan may be connected to that is because of a hearing that was held in the United States in 2023, where the US Congress, and because there's a bit of a hiccup with AUKUS, because they've agreed to sell us submarines that they don't produce enough of for themselves. And so there's some pushback in the American political system against this deal just for that reason. And some of the congressmen were grilling the US officials involved in AUKUS. And one of the questions was, how do we know we can trust the Australians with our proprietary technology? And one of the officials, a woman, answered by citing Dan's case, not by name, but by you could identify she was talking about Dan's case, to say the Australians had shown in Dan's case that they are serious about protecting America's, the integrity of its weapons and whatever. Because Dan's case involves, using training with weapons. It covers. Dan's case is the only. It's under the law called that the US has against trafficking in arms. They have these things called trafficking in arms regulations, and you can traffic in arms, but they're very heavily regulated. For instance, I'll give you an example. The French Mirage fighter jets are entirely a French creation, but the paint job is American. It's American. The technology and the paint is American. For that reason, the French aren't allowed to sell those jets. Right? That's just enough. So this is really strict stuff. And this Dan is the only person ever to be charged under trafficking in arms for providing training. Right. So
Right.
anyway, but this is so it's in this
We,
realm, and that's
yeah.
why this woman cited this case to say, see, the Australians are serious about protecting our
Well, that
integrity.
is such a humiliation for Australia and the Australian people that first of all of the laws of dual criminality and all this stuff, like Australia is bending over backwards to give Dan, their own citizen, up to the U.S., helping to block him selling his property, just basically doing all this stuff. Meanwhile, the U.S. government is still saying, people are still asking the question, can we trust the Australians? That's the first stick of the knife, where Australians think that you guys are such good buddies with the U.S., but they're still asking this question. But then they have to mention, not directly by name, but they have to mention Dan's case as an example of Australia going to extraordinary lengths to ignore even their own laws and to even sacrifice their own citizens for America. And so it makes me wonder, it makes me think that when you said the Attorney General said that she has no power to do this, even though legally she does, if it was a Freudian slip of sorts where it's above her head and there's stuff that's going on that means that she's not even allowed to use her legal rights in this case because you guys are just bending over backwards for the U.S.
Well, you're not. Well, actually, I'm glad you said that because in that sense, you're not wrong. The way the politics of this works in Australia, they are conditioned from the very time they get into Parliament that these things are above their pay grade, right? It would take an Attorney General of extraordinary personal fortitude to be prepared to defy the Americans in a case like this, and that probably is therefore a Freudian slip. Um, and I just want to come back to what you said about bending over backwards, because there's another detail that I've started to appreciate more recently. There's a lot more attention coming on this case. When you and I first talked about this case the first few times, we were some of the only people in the world talking about it. But
Right.
now that there is, thanks to those efforts, there is more people that have started speaking up, and I'll reference some of them in a minute. But there's a particular detail of how much they bent over backwards, and it's mind blowing how it worked. In 2017, when a grand jury was impaneled in Washington to indict Dan Duggan, they requested there was a statute of limitations over the particular charge, and it was about to run out. They requested what's called a tolling period, right, where they basically suspend the time frame, and they requested a 5-year tolling period for the statute of limitations not to run out. And in that time, they sent a message back to Australia requesting more information about the case. Australia's response was to enact a law in 2018, which we hadn't had before, which is about a law against training, providing military training to other countries.
Yep.
And then that law is what has been used to justify the dual criminality requirement for extradition. And this is what you reference, right? This is the retrospective application of a law to justify it. But the overwhelming suspicion is that request by the grand jury and the tolling period was to allow time for that law to be manufactured to fit Dan's case.
Wow. Wow.
This is what the poor guy is up against.
Right. I mean, and you see what is going on in Australia to just disregard the rights of an Australian citizen to make this happen for the U.S. It makes you wonder that once he gets into the U.S., is he even going to have a chance at a fair trial? And it reminds me of something that you said before that was a really great point. And you can finish off the point, but I'll remind you of it and see if you remember it. You were saying that even the current sitting president and the previous president indicated that they themselves have no trust in the justice system. Do you remember that point you made?
100%. Donald Trump will be the first to tell you the U.S. justice system is completely corrupt, because that's his response to the fact that he got found guilty in these trials just before he got elected. And then why did Joe Biden, apparently using some kind of robot, sign all those pardons, right?
For
Including
Hunter
for
Biden
his
also,
own
yep.
son, right? And for very specific time periods. What was he saying by doing that? And he actually said it explicitly with his son.
He did.
He knows the Justice Department will be weaponized against him. So
Right.
these are the two most recent presidents saying our Justice Department is not fair and balanced. It doesn't have integrity. It is a weaponized, corrupt system. And the reason I speak, even before I knew the details I know now, Daniel, about Dan's case, the reason I was prepared to speak out so forcefully, and the Citizens Party is simply because we knew in the political climate he would never get a fair trial,
Right.
whether in Australia and especially not in the United States. It's just not going to happen. This is such a charged political climate against China. It's just impossible. And so our attitude was, well, the only hope this guy has is if we can stop him from being extradited at all.
Right.
And because he's an Australian citizen, you would think his government would fight for him, but of course they won't. And I think, to me, that's the fundamental point for all Australians here. It's not the case is bigger than Dan. It's actually about Australian sovereignty.
Yeah.
Right? We do not have any, and you could contrast what the Australian government is prepared to do to get Dan to, even as corrupted as America is, and what we've just said and what the American presidents say. America has a Bill of Rights, and even beyond that, they would never allow another country to come to them and say, we're going to take your citizen away. They would just never allow it.
Yeah.
You already cited this. There's a principle in American law that if someone's action was innocent at the time it was done, then you can't come and retrospectively apply something to try and bring charges against such a person. And in fact, because I talked to Dan Duggan, and because he has nothing but time on his hands to stew over his own case, he told me the precedent for that goes back to 1798. It was a ruling by a Justice Bull, who's the one who said, yeah, if it was innocent at the time it was done, then that person is innocent,
Right.
right? You can't apply anything. So that these are strong principles in American law. We don't have, because Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights. We've got a constitution that's a British Act of Parliament, and we have what they call implied rights. And most of the time, they seem to exist, except you find out how implied they are when push comes to shove and the government it finds them inconvenient, because then they'll just shove them aside, right, and achieve their goal. In this case, their goal, while on bended knee to the United States government, is to hand up a sacrificial pawn to them for their war agenda against China.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's unbelievable, and what he's going through, is quite. Are you? Or sorry, I got cut off there for a bit. It's just, and I mean, as he's a father of 6 children. I have 5 kids. I thought I was already one of the record holders here, but he's got 6, and 3 years is such a long time to be away from young kids, and he will never get this back. And I couldn't stop thinking about, like, I saw this video the other day too, that was talking about how you're always cleaning these little fingerprints off of the glass and all this stuff from kids, and he says, one day these fingerprints are going to be gone. There's going to be no more toys to pick up, no more big bundles of laundry to do, and to your surprise, you're going to miss it. And he's missing all of it already, and he's never going to get these years back. 3 years is a long time. And if he actually does go to the US, it's game over. That's exactly why they know they're trying so hard to prevent him from being able to fund his own case. That's why it's so important for us to try to help him so that he can fight this. But they know that as soon as he goes there, it's game over, and he might be seeing 65 years in prison, or at bare minimum, do some sort of a plea deal where he's still, going to lose all of this time and probably many more years before this whole ordeal is over.
And bankrupted. I mean, this is a guy who's even if it's whatever happens in this, he's got the 3 years now. Whatever happens, if it goes to a plea deal, he'll know. Who knows? Even if he doesn't spend 65 years in prison, completely ruined financially, completely traumatized as a family. Just so some of the most despicable politicians in the world can make a political point in their agenda to start this conflict. And this is, only his fellow citizens, right, and people of goodwill are going to rally around him, because what we expect governments to do to provide protections here, they're absolutely not going to do. Dan Duggan is an example that for Australians, that your government will not protect you if the government coming after you is the United States.
Yeah.
Right?
It's incredible. And I know that Julian Assange has this, a big personality attached to him, and he did something big, which is why it has a lot more attention. But people should be paying attention to this. And it just blows me away that all of this time, it was just the two of us pretty much really trying to push this and get people to pay attention. And I'm going to do some name dropping here because, or to hopefully get their attention, because you have some amazing YouTubers in Australia, like Boy and Friendly Geordies and things like that. So if anybody's watching this and are fans of them, send them messages, put messages in their comments, try to get them to pick up on this story too, because these guys, this is exactly the kind of thing that they would love to cover. But it's just been so good. Everybody's done a good job at keeping this under wraps and not allowing this story to propagate. More people need to know about it.
100%. Look, all those guys need to jump on board. We're going to be putting out a flyer in the next few days. We're going to be deploying our party members right around Australia to distribute this everywhere. It'll have, and in fact, I want to give a detail now. Aside from the where people can we'll put the links below for where people can donate. There's a couple of platforms that you can go to. One's called freedanduggan.org, and that's where you can see a lot of information there. And then there's a specific fundraising platform called My Cause, which is for this hearing. But anything you can do to help. However, on top of that, one of the things we're going to try and do is for the next 5 weeks, bombard the Attorney General from the public with messages saying "Free Dan Duggan." and
Yep.
her name, her email is Michelle, Michelle .Rowland, ROWLAND .MP at aph.gov.au, and APH stands for Australian Parliament House. That's
Okay.
the Attorney General's email, and we'll put that below. We're going to be putting that out everywhere, and
Yeah.
people around the world, if you have any connection to Australia, send an email as well, right? We want to swamp her for the next 5 weeks, because she does have powers that she can deny them all she likes, but it's not good enough. There's 8 Australian citizens whose lives are at stake here, right?
Yeah.
One in jail, and the 7 members of his family who are collateral damage. And it's not good enough for what her position is. So we're going to bombard her. So
Yeah.
please make a donation and send an email to this Attorney General.
Right. And at bare minimum, let's get her to admit that she's got no power because Australia is losing its sovereignty to the U.S. And that there's so much more going on in the back end. I mean, I know you should probably never admit that, but she's going to have a really difficult time trying to explain this when she is saying something that is just completely untrue. With that said, I think we'll wrap up here. I've got to pick up my kids from school, and that's something I'm still able to do. And I always think about that, though, when I think the context of,
He got
Dan's
arrested
family.
He got arrested dropping his kids off at school.
And you said his house was broken into a couple times too, right?
Yeah, this house that they were not allowed to sell, it's now been broken into 3 times since they've had this caveat on it, and it's just and it's the worst thing really for Dan, because he's in prison and he's the father of the family, he's the man of the
He can't
house.
protect them.
He's totally powerless, and it really messes with his mental health when these sorts of things happen.
Oh, I would have an absolute breakdown if I saw that happening, and I'm not out there to be able to protect my family, let alone see my children grow up. It's just tragic. But yeah, everybody, whatever you can do to help, the links are in the description in terms of spreading awareness, reaching out to the Attorney General, supporting his legal fund, whatever you guys can do. More people need to know about this. So thanks again, Robbie, for joining. We'll wrap it up there, and we'll keep an eye on the comments too. Let us know if you guys have any more questions.
Yeah,
thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.